My name is Corinne Hale, and on the morning my cousin claimed my father's house, the city felt strangely ordinary. I was making coffee in my small rented apartment, watching steam curl from the mug as traffic hummed below my window. The kettle's soft clicking, the faint whir of my ancient fridge, the muted buzz of my phone on the counter, everything felt normal, until I read the message that split my life into before and after. It was from my Aunt Lydia. Corinne, I heard you're not taking the house. Owen signed it over to Mason before he passed. I hope this doesn't cause trouble. The locksmith is changing everything today. I read it twice. My fingers went cold around the mug. The house. My father's house. The narrow white one with the maple tree out front and the cracked stone path he promised we'd fix one of these summers. It was the place I'd always imagined returning to when life finally calmed down. The place we'd sat in after chemo sessions, eating soup and pretending he wasn't getting thinner. The place he'd told me, more than once, was mine. I called her. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Aunt Lydia, what do you mean, changing everything? There was the rustle of fabric, the clink of dishes on her end. Oh, Corinne. I thought you knew. Mason said there was an agreement. Your father signed the house over to him as thanks for helping with the medical bills and errands. He's at the property now with the lawyer and the locksmith. I just assumed you approved it. In my chest, something slid sideways. I ended the call politely, I remember that, the strange autopilot of manners, and stared at the far wall. The paint there was peeling at the edges. I'd always meant to complain to the landlord, but I never did. I think part of me believed I wouldn't need this place much longer. I opened my father's last text instead. A blurry photo of our front porch at sunset, light spilling onto the old steps, his caption, I left the porch light on. When you're ready, we'll pick a new color for that door. He'd sent it 3 weeks before the stroke. I grabbed my coat and keys, heart pounding in a dull, steady rhythm. The late autumn air hit my face as I stepped outside, cool and damp, smelling faintly of exhaust and rain. I got into my car and drove, mind racing in tight circles. There hadn't been any mention of the house being transferred in the will reading. Just the standard division of his modest savings, personal items, and the note that I was his sole heir. The house was his largest asset, the only true anchor left in our family story. How could he have signed it over to my cousin without telling me? As I drove past fields turning brown for winter and gas stations blinking in the pale light, I thought about Mason, my older cousin by 4 years, with his confident smile and expensive watch he never explained. Growing up, he'd been charming, the golden boy. Lately, he was also perpetually between jobs, and always just a little too interested in my father's health updates. The closer I got to the town where I grew up, the heavier my chest felt. The sky was a dull silver, low clouds pressed down over the roofs like a lid. When I finally turned onto my father's street, my stomach twisted. There it was, the house. The maple tree's leaves were almost all gone, branches scratching softly against the siding in the breeze. My father's old porch light was on, but the front door was propped open, and a van from a locksmith company was parked in the driveway. I parked across the street and sat for a moment, fingers gripping the steering wheel, watching strangers carry in small metal cases and tool bags. The sound of a drill echoed faintly, muffled by the walls I used to lean against as a kid, listening to my father's radio. It was an ordinary scene, a service van, a house, a lock being changed. But sitting in that car, I understood something quietly devastating. I was being erased from my own home, one screw at a time. I waited until the locksmith's van pulled away before I crossed the street. The grass along the path was damp and soft beneath my boots, pressing out a faint smell of earth. My breath made pale clouds in the air. The new lock on the front door gleamed, too bright against the worn wood of the frame, like a replacement tooth in an old smile. Before I could knock, the door opened inward. Mason stood there, leaning against the frame like he already owned the place. He was in a dark sweater and jeans that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Behind him, a leather messenger bag rested on my father's hall table, where Dad had always kept a chipped ceramic bowl for his keys and loose screws. "Corinne," he said smoothly. "You made it." I looked past him first. The hallway, with its faded runner and family photos, was exactly as I remembered. Only now there were folders stacked on the entry cabinet, a sleek laptop on the console, and the subtle, sterile scent of some expensive cologne that did not belong to my father. "Mason," I replied. My voice was quiet, but the air between us felt tight. "Aunt Lydia said you changed the locks." His smile was sympathetic, almost practiced. "It's just a formality. The lawyer suggested it, with the transfer. I didn't want anything happening to the property while probate's still in motion." "Probate?" I repeated. "Dad's will named me his heir. There was no mention of you." His eyes flickered, just for a second. Then he stepped aside, gesturing me in. "We should talk inside. I don't want the neighbors listening." I stepped into the house and the familiar creak of the floorboard near the threshold made my throat close for a heartbeat. The light from the front windows spilled across the worn rug, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Somewhere, a clock ticked with steady patience. We sat at the dining table, the same one where Dad and I once spread out jigsaw pieces and medical bills side by side. A man in a gray suit was already there, typing on a tablet. He looked up, offering a polite smile. "Miss Hale." "I'm David Carter, handling the property transfer." "Property transfer to whom?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mason cleared his throat. "Uncle Owen and I had an agreement. I helped him with hospital runs, medication, house repairs. He didn't want to burden you while you were in the city. In return, he promised the house. We signed a deed of transfer before he passed. David's finalizing everything." I thought of my father, sitting in this same room, insisting I stay focused on my job, on my life, that he had help and didn't want me driving back and forth every week. I'd believed him. Trusted him. Trusted that he'd tell me if he planned something this huge. "If that's true," I said quietly, "why did the will still name me his heir?" The lawyer folded his hands. "Sometimes documents overlap. We have a signed deed, dated 6 weeks before your father's passing. That generally takes precedence over older expressions of intent." 6 weeks before. That was when Dad's speech had started to slur. When he'd call me at odd hours, forgetting what we were talking about halfway through. When the doctors warned us about cognitive changes. I stared at the man in the suit. Was my father fully competent when he signed it? "That's a serious allegation, Miss Hale," he said, tone still mild. "From what I can see, the paperwork is in order." "And you weren't there," Mason added. "It was just me and Uncle Owen. He knew what he wanted. He didn't want you stuck here, tied down by a crumbling house." A wave of shame and anger washed over me, because there was a piece of truth tangled in his lie. I had left. I had gone back to the city after every visit, clutching my father's assurances like a life raft. I'd believed he wanted me to go. I'd believed I could come back when he was better, or when we had time to talk properly. Now the house that held every version of me, the little girl reading on the stairs, the teenager slamming doors after breakups, the woman brewing tea for a sick father, was being described like a real estate asset on a spreadsheet. David the lawyer slid a folder across the table toward me. "You're entitled to review copies, of course. But I should be honest, fighting this will be difficult. Expensive. Expensive." That word slid into my chest and settled next to all the others I carried: rent, utilities, student loans, the unpaid days off I'd taken while Dad was in the hospital. Mason watched me with a softness that almost passed for concern. "Corinne, I'm not trying to hurt you. I can't undo what Uncle Owen wanted. But once it's finalized, I'd be open to something. Maybe you could stay here a while, rent-free, until you get back on your feet. We're family." The room seemed to tilt slightly. The house was worth more than money. It was my last tangible connection to my father, to the roots I'd always assumed I could return to. Losing it meant losing a piece of who I was, and accepting that someone who shared my blood had quietly stepped into that space with a pen and a locksmith. I closed the folder without reading. The paper felt heavy beneath my fingertips. "I'll review it," I said. "Properly. With my own lawyer." Mason's smile thinned. For the first time, I saw the impatience under the charm. "Of course," he said. "Just remember, Corinne, the longer this drags on, the harder it'll be. For everyone." I didn't sleep much that week. My apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls closer, the hum of the refrigerator louder. At night, I lay awake listening to the faint distant sirens and the occasional car door slam, replaying every conversation I'd ever had with my father about the house. Asterisk, "It'll be yours someday, Corey girl." Asterisk. Asterisk, "When I'm old and grumpy and you're sick of me, just stick me in the back room." Asterisk. Asterisk, "This place should always have your key on the hook." Asterisk. My key. I stared at it, hanging on the small rack near my apartment door. The warm brass felt rough in my palm when I took it down. It didn't matter that Mason had changed the lock, the shape of it still carried years of turning, of coming home. On Friday, I drove back to the house while the sky was still a flat, colorless gray. The street was quiet. Mason's car wasn't there. I let myself in with the door code my father had insisted on installing after a break-in scare years ago. Mason had changed the locks, but he hadn't thought about the keypad. The faint beep 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 sounded like a heartbeat as I entered the familiar digits. The latch clicked. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old books and the citrus cleaner my father liked. Light filtered through the thin curtains, painting soft stripes on the floor. Dust had already begun to settle on the boxes of medication we hadn't yet cleared away. I walked straight to his study. The room was small, lined with shelves, the desk pushed up against the window so he could work in natural light. His reading glasses lay folded beside a cold, empty mug. The chair was slightly askew, as if he'd just stood up and never sat back down. The top drawers of the desk were neat. Pens lined up, rubber bands in a jar, a stack of unpaid utility bills held with a bulldog clip. In the bottom drawer, I found old tax returns, hand-scribbled notes, a faded photograph of my mother I hadn't seen in years. Nothing about a transfer. No mysterious new documents. No secret confessions. I sat back on my heels, frustration simmering just beneath the surface of my tiredness. Maybe there was nothing to find. Maybe my father had made a desperate, pressured decision and I was clinging to a narrative that made me feel less abandoned. The morning sun shifted, sliding across the desk. That's when I saw it, a faint line beneath the bottom drawer, a hairline gap where wood didn't quite meet wood. I pulled the drawer all the way out and placed it on the floor. Behind it, recessed into the back panel, was a shallow cavity I'd never noticed. At the top edge, something silver glinted. Taped there, with old, yellowing masking tape, was a small, ordinary-looking key. For a moment, all I could do was stare. My heart started to thud in my ears as I peeled the tape away. The key was cool against my skin, lighter than I expected. On its tiny, scratched surface, my father's handwriting crowded in blue ink, *, spare, desk, C. *. Except the desk already had a key. There was a small brass one still in the lock of the center drawer. We'd never locked it, not once in my life. And this key looked slightly different. Longer. I stood up slowly and ran my fingers along the underside of the desktop, searching for something that matched the unease curling in my stomach. There, near the back corner, my fingers caught on a small metal notch. I crouched, craning my neck. Hidden just beneath the lip of the desk was a tiny keyhole, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry, and slid the key in. It turned with a soft, decisive click. A panel at the back of the central drawer compartment shifted, revealing a narrow hidden space. Inside, wrapped in a plain manila envelope and a folded plastic sleeve, lay the last answers my father would ever give me. My hands shook as I slid them out and set them on the desk, the paper whispering against the wood. The envelope had my name on it in my father's slow, careful handwriting, asterisk for Corinne, if things get complicated. Asterisk. A laugh, small and incredulous, escaped me. Of course he would phrase it like that. I opened the letter first. The sheet inside smelled faintly of his aftershave and the musty scent of old paper. The ink had bled slightly where his hand must have trembled. Cory girl. Asterisk if you're reading this, it means I didn't find a clean way to talk to you about everything before my time ran out. I'm sorry. You deserved better than my stubborn pride and my fear of frightening you, asterisk. Asterisk your cousin has been helping around here, yes. But he's also been pushing. Talking a lot about planning ahead and making sure the house doesn't become a burden to you. I let him drive me to appointments when you were working, and somewhere in there, he convinced me to sign some papers I didn't fully understand. I signed because I was tired, and because I felt guilty asking you for more than you already gave, asterisk. A tightness gripped my chest. Asterisk I regretted it almost immediately. I contacted my lawyer and had him draw up a revocation and a new deed, returning the house to my estate with you as sole heir. He told me we needed to move quickly. If I didn't get to tell you all this in person, these documents should speak for me, asterisk. Asterisk I know you, Corinne. You will question whether fighting for this house is worth it. You'll think of your bills, your work, your desire not to cause a fuss. But I am asking you, plainly, don't let yourself be bullied out of what is yours. This isn't about money. It's about you having a home in this world that you can trust, asterisk. Asterisk the spare key will make sure you find this when you're ready. I left the porch light on as long as I could, asterisk. Love always. Dad. My vision blurred. I sat there in the quiet of his study, the ticking clock suddenly loud, the faint rustle of bare branches against the window like distant whispers. When I finally opened the plastic sleeve, 2 documents slid into the light, both bearing my father's shaky signature and the crisp, precise stamp of his lawyer. One revoked the earlier transfer to Mason. The other reaffirmed the house as part of my father's estate, with a handwritten note at the bottom, asterisk, discussed with client while fully lucid and oriented. Asterisk dated 4 weeks before his death. The betrayal hadn't been my father's. And for the first time since the locks changed, I felt something in me click into place, as clean and final as that hidden key turning in its lock. The next Monday, the house looked different in the morning light. Frost clung to the edges of the front steps, catching the pale sun in tiny sparks. My breath came out in soft white clouds as I stood on the porch, the envelope from the desk tucked safely into my bag. The porch light, on a timer my father had set years ago, flicked off as the day brightened, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Inside, the lawyer my father had trusted sat at the dining table, sorting through papers with methodical care. His name was Alan Mercer, a soft-spoken man with silver hair and steady eyes. Beside him, my own coffee steamed faintly in the quiet. These are solid, he said, tapping the revocation and the new deed with a capped pen. Dated, witnessed, and notarized. The note about your father's mental state will carry weight, particularly against a transfer signed in the middle of his treatment, with no independent counsel present. I thought of Mason, guiding Dad to appointments, filling his prescriptions. Guiding him, too, into signing away the home he'd built for us. What happens now? I asked. Alan folded his hands. We notify the other attorney, Mr. Carter, that there is a subsequent deed and revocation. We ask him to halt any further action on the prior transfer. If they cooperate, we settle this through probate court. If they don't, we file a petition and let a judge decide. Will it get ugly? My voice was level, but I felt the question in my bones. Family disputes over property often do, he admitted. But you have your father's clear intent on your side. And the law. The word law had always felt cold to me, something distant, wielded by people with power and time. Now, with my father's letter under my fingertips, it felt like a rope thrown across a widening gap. When Mason arrived that afternoon, he walked in like he still owned the room. Corinne, he said, shrugging off his coat. I wasn't expecting a meeting today, but sure, if this speeds things up. He stopped when he saw Alan at the table, the spread of documents. What's going on? His eyes narrowed slightly. I gestured to the chair across from us. Sit down, please. Alan spoke first, his tone calm and measured. Mr. Pike, I'm Alan Mercer. I represented Owen Hale for several years. We've become aware of subsequent legal instruments affecting the property in question. Mason gave a quick, tight smile. With all due respect, I've already been working with Mr. Carter. The transfer's nearly finalized. That may no longer be accurate, Alan replied, sliding the revocation across the table toward him. Your uncle executed a deed revoking the earlier transfer and returned the property to his estate. Here is the recorded date and the witness's information. Mason picked up the document, skimming. A flush rose on his cheeks. This can't be right. He never mentioned. There's also this, I said quietly, placing my father's letter between us. He did mention it. To me. In case things got complicated. For a moment, the only sound was the refrigerator humming in the background and the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Mason didn't reach for the letter. His eyes flicked over my face instead, looking for a weakness, the old habit of his. Corinne, you don't want to do this. Lawyers, courts, it's going to tear everyone apart. Your dad asked me for help because you were too busy with your life in the city. He didn't want to burden you. He burdened himself, I replied. And then he tried to fix it. He was sick when you got him to sign that first transfer. You knew that. You counted on it. His jaw flexed. You can't prove that. Alan spoke again, voice mild. A judge will consider the context, Mr. Pike. The timing of the documents. The medical records will subpoena. The fact that a revocation exists at all. I would advise your attorney to review these carefully before proceeding. Mason's eyes flashed toward my bag, as if he could see the weight of my father's handwriting inside it. This doesn't have to be a war, he said, softer now. We're family. We can come to an understanding. I held his gaze, remembering his offer of rent-free pity, his hurried lock changes, his careful omission of anything that might have warned me. My understanding, I said, is that my father wanted me to have a home. Not a deal. Not a compromise. A home. He leaned back, the chair creaking. The confident ease he usually wore like armor seemed to slip. For the first time, I saw the fear underneath, not just of losing the house, but of being seen for what he'd done. Fine, he said. We'll let the court decide. Just remember, Corinne, once lawyers get involved, nobody really wins. We're already here, I replied, not unkindly. I'm just choosing not to lose quietly. The hearing took place 3 months later, in a modest courtroom that smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The carpet was a worn blue-gray. There was nothing dramatic about it, no shouting, no gavel slamming with theatrical flourish. Just measured questions, documents entered into evidence, and the soft scratch of the court reporter's keys. I sat at our table, my hands folded in my lap, listening as Alan laid out the timeline, my father's diagnosis, the progression of his illness, the initial transfer when he was most vulnerable, the later revocation when his mind had cleared enough to understand the consequences. My father's doctor testified via video, explaining the cognitive side effects of his treatment. A neighbor spoke about seeing Mason arrive frequently with stacks of papers, staying for hours, leaving with my father looking exhausted. Finally, the judge read my father's letter silently, his expression unreadable. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the rustle of fabric as Mason shifted in his seat. When the decision came, it was in a calm, measured voice. The court finds that the later deed and revocation represent the true, considered intent of the deceased. The transfer to Mr. Pike is set aside. The property will remain in Mr. Hale's estate and pass according to the terms of his will. There was no applause. No dramatic music. Just the soft exhale of my breath and the faint scrape of chairs as people stood. Justice didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the slow, steady unclenching of a fist I hadn't realized I'd been making since the day the locks changed. Spring came late that year. The snow melted in shy patches, leaving behind damp earth and small, stubborn shoots of green that pushed up along the edges of the cracked stone path. The maple tree out front wore a thin haze of new leaves, a promise more than a fact. I stood on the porch of my father's house, my house, holding a small cardboard box filled with things that felt like anchors, his watch, my childhood library card, a framed photo of us covered in flour from that disastrous attempt at homemade bread. The new lock on the door was one I'd chosen myself. The key sat warm in my palm for a moment before I slid it in. The familiar click sounded different now, like a question finally answered. Inside, the house was both exactly the same and entirely altered by absence. Dust still gathered on the top edges of picture frames. The same faded couch sagged slightly in the living room. The kitchen drawers still stuck halfway when you pulled them too fast. Yet the air held a new quiet that was not just grief, but possibility. I spent the first week here alone, moving slowly from room to room. I opened curtains that had been drawn tight since my father's last illness. Light poured in, revealing small things I'd never really noticed, the faint pattern on the wallpaper in the hallway, the way afternoon sun turned the stairwell into a corridor of gold, the tiny chip on the edge of the bathroom sink shaped like a crescent moon. I fixed what I could. Tightened screws. Replaced burnt-out bulbs. Cleaned out cupboards full of expired spices and half-used tins of tea. The work was small, repetitive, soothing. Some evenings, I sat at my father's desk, the hidden panel now permanently open, the letter resting in a simple frame beside the lamp. The words were familiar enough that I could recite them by memory, but I still read them, tracing each line with my eyes as if they were steps on a path I was learning to walk. Asterisk, this isn't about money. It's about you having a home in this world that you can trust. Asterisk. Mason and I didn't speak much after the hearing. He sent a single text, months later, asterisk, I'm sorry it went that far. Asterisk, I stared at it for a long time before replying, asterisk, I'm sorry it had to. Asterisk, there was nothing else to say that wouldn't reopen something that had finally begun to close. My victory had not ruined him, the court's decision hadn't left him destitute or ostracized. He still had his life, his choices, his reflection to confront in whatever quiet moments he allowed. That felt, in its own way, like justice too, not a dramatic downfall, but a mirror he couldn't easily look away from. As for me, I did something my father might not have expected, I didn't move in right away. Not fully. Instead, I turned the back bedroom into a small studio, with a folding table for my laptop and a shelf for my sketchbooks. I split my time between the city and the house, slowly easing my life into this new shape instead of forcing it to fit overnight. On weekends, I opened the windows and let the sounds of the neighborhood drift in, children riding bikes, a lawnmower in the distance, birds arguing softly in the maple tree. I brewed tea in my father's old kettle and sat on the porch steps with a blanket over my knees, watching the light change on the street. It wasn't the grand, cinematic reclaiming I'd once secretly imagined. There were no dramatic renovations, no tearful speeches to a gathered family. Just small, deliberate acts of ownership, replacing a picture on the wall. Planting a line of herbs along the kitchen window. Leaving my favorite mug next to my father's on the shelf. One rainy afternoon, I found myself at the desk again, pen poised over a blank sheet of paper. The soft patter of rain against the windows wrapped the house in a gentle hush. The lamp cast a warm circle of light on the wood, highlighting the faint scratch marks from years of use. I began to write. Not a legal document, not a desperate plea, but a simple letter, to myself. This house is not a prize you won in a fight. It is a place you chose to stand. It is proof that you are allowed to take up space in your own story. I wrote about the girl who had once believed she had to be small and accommodating, who had quietly accepted that other people knew better what to do with her life, her time, even her memories. I wrote about the woman who had sat in a courtroom and listened as the truth was weighed and measured, and still chose to stay when the dust settled. When I finished, I folded the letter and slid it into the hidden compartment of the desk, beside my father's. I turned the little key, hearing the same soft click. For the first time, the house felt less like something I had defended and more like something I was slowly learning to belong to. As evening fell, I stepped out onto the porch and flicked the light on. It glowed against the growing dark, a small, steady beacon. My father had left it on for me as long as he could. Now, it was my turn to decide when, and for whom, it would shine. I stood there for a while, listening to the hum of the quiet street, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the maple tree. The air smelled of wet pavement and new beginnings. Revenge, I realized, hadn't been about taking something away from Mason. It had been about taking myself back, my sense of what I deserved, my right to ask questions, my ability to say, calmly and firmly, this is mine. The house didn't erase the grief of losing my father. It didn't fix every crack in our family's history. But it gave me a place to stand, to remember, to grow. And that, in the end, was all the home I needed.